So I've got one over here.
Okay, good evening everybody. Can you all hear me? Welcome to the AA. I'm James Hume. I'm the coordinator of the professional programme here. But in a more informal capacity, I've brought together a few of my mates this evening for what I hope will be an enjoyable and interesting discussion. The overarching theme of this evening's AA Collections talk is the emergence of a new kind of post-war architecture, which was not confined to a particular type of building, encompassing housing, educational buildings, leisure buildings, civic buildings, but one which shared as a vocabulary a scale, often a monumentality, certainly an originality, which has meant it's made an imprint on London in particular, along with other global cities, which one cannot escape, and in recent history has become the subject of attention from a new generation of interpreters of the built environment who have shown an interest in what is now an increasingly historical period in history. And two of the interpreters are here with us tonight and are going to share their thoughts on a particular post-war period of architecture and their views on how it can be interpreted for the increasing numbers of people, not only within the architectural profession, but more widely amongst more general audiences who are interested in the period and fascinated to learn more about it. Tom Cordell has done a great deal to stimulate this interest through his filmmaking. Tom's work started out by looking at contemporary youth music scenes like drum and bass, progressed through documentaries encompassing a wide range of subjects, I believe, including crime and various social issues, to focus on an increasing interest in architecture. So his Utopia London film, which you'll see a snippet of tonight, and which is going to be shown later in the week at the AA for members and students. You made that in 2010, I believe, as a response to his own interest in the city he grew up in and how it was radically changed at a very specific moment in time. He's taken a very strong interest in the housing, in particular, of London and housing issues, and I think will probably speak to themes of contrast between the way housing as a mammoth issue in the 50s and 60s was addressed and similar parallels with housing problems we have today. And I hope these are some themes we can draw out during the course of the evening. Joe Watson is our other speaker tonight. Joe's the London Creative Director of the National Trust. I think I'm probably right in saying this is a first for the AA and the National Trust to collaborate on a venture, so particularly pleased with that. Joe's own interests in architecture extend from the National Trust's traditional stomping ground of historic and beautiful houses and gardens to appraisal of more recent brutalist architecture. And last summer he held a very successful series of events and tours, again with Tom's participation, on brutalist buildings around London, and I hope he'll be able to speak to that a little bit. As I understand it, phenomenally popular and broke new ground for the National Trust, not only in terms of themes and ideas, but audiences and coverage. I think you took the media by storm.
We did.
So I just want to acknowledge the role of the AA in helping to facilitate this evening as part of their collections series. So the AA Photo Library and AA Archive of students' work have come together to host this event tonight and have laid out a small number of significant objects from those collections which pertain to early students' work from the AA of the 40s and 50s vintage from people who subsequently became singular figures in the sorts of architectural movements that we're talking about tonight. Similarly, historic material from the library and the photo library are all up at the front, and I'd encourage you to take a look at those at the end if you have the time. We will split the evening roughly between 20 or so minutes dialogue between our two protagonists here, and then take questions from you all for what I hope is going to be an interesting evening. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Joe and Tom. Thanks.
Fab. Well, welcome everyone. Very good to see you here. Thank you very much for coming. Maybe start with some audience participation. I just want to know how many of you have actually seen Utopia London. Could you put your hands up if you have? So you've got a fair few. That's good.
That's
Excellent. Excellent. That's very
heartwarming.
Good. Yes, it is heartwarming indeed. The format for the evening, we're going to actually see a little excerpt in just a couple of minutes from Utopia London, particularly for those of you who haven't seen any of it. Tom and I will talk about for about 20 minutes, and then, as James said, we'll throw open the floor to you. Tom knows that I'm very broadly in line with his political stance on a lot of this stuff, but I will have to play devil's advocate on occasion. So if I come across as the bad guy, I promise you, it's not actually the case. Broadly, I'm going to ask him a little bit about the making of the film, and then of course we'll talk about the content, and round off, I hope, with some reflections about what it might all mean for now, for architecture, for heritage, and also for architectural education. But first, let's see a clip.
Okay, this is...
In the new London borough of Lambeth, the planners were at work pioneering a vision of society for the 1960s. They saw modern public services as the foundation stone of a new type of community. This building, the work of a young idealist called George Finch, was one of the first to demonstrate the idea. Now that the post-war crisis had passed, George could sketch in a future that above all would be more fun.
With Lambeth Towers, I think I got closest to what I would like to do in terms of inner-city building. The idea of having a number of things going on in a particular grouping, so that you would have, as I could see, you would have bits of the city which were a nursery school, a doctor's group practice, shops, workshops, flats and houses, playgrounds, all in a block that was interesting and lively, and things were going on there. And you didn't have far to go from one thing that you wanted to another thing you wanted. So you would cut down on transport.
At its heart, this mix of social facilities exemplified the new politics of the 1960s. Labour had struggled to respond to the birth of the consumer age during the 1950s. The old left vision of class-based political struggle had blurred as prosperity spread across society. By the early 60s, a new generation of socialists had emerged. They believed that they knew how to make labour relevant again. They would use the power of government to offer the best consumer products of the welfare state, distributed fairly across income and age groups. This promise of better healthcare, pensions, schools and housing brought Labour back into government nationally in October 1964. Immediately, they started work on building their new vision of modernity.
And here we are at the living space, which gives you a view of the Imperial War Museum, trees, rest of London, and off the dining space you get a balcony and a view to the south.
The politics of the 1960s promised that technology would bring about a new type of freedom, liberating workers from long hours of hard labour. The working week would shrink and free time would come to dominate human life. George's drawings make human contentment seem almost within reach of this top-floor balcony.
I designed for everybody. You know, this is the sort of house, flat I would like to live in. Everybody's important. I mean, they may be lower paid, but they're the people that collect the rubbish, serve in the shops, behind the counter in the group practice admin area. All these people, very important to society. This idea now of building social housing, which discriminates a certain group of people who are not up to the standard of being able to buy their own house, I am very uncomfortable with. I think it's a really bad way of going about it.
After his success with Lambeth Towers, George's next project was to insert 8 of these massive 23-storey blocks into the existing fabric of the borough. This, the planners believed, would provide desperately needed modern homes while preserving the best of the existing city. It was an advance on the complete demolition and rebuilding that was taking place in other parts of London. The tower blocks would provide continuity with the past city while eliminating the borough's terrible slum housing.
Those prefabricated towers in Lambeth are real landmarks, and they do a much more dynamic thing than most tower blocks that you see around London. They do sort of say, this is Lambeth, look at us. You know, we've got the worst housing conditions in Britain and we are doing something about them.
You get this arrangement of them so they're not lined up, so you get this sense of dancing around.
In these sketches, George called out to a happier vision of modernity. Concord, soaring above the towers, offered the hope that perhaps one day these old ladies would get to travel somewhere more exotic than the Old Kent Road.
Concord flying over I would not have agreed with now. Bit noisy.
It's very optimistic though, isn't it?
Well, it was. I mean, at that time, we were optimistic about what we could do, and we were trying out a number of different things, some of which were more successful than others, but we hoped that we would go on doing these things and building on what we were learning.
In this sprint towards the future, leisure always went far beyond the home. Lambeth commissioned George to design this sports centre at the heart of the borough in Brixton. As always with George's sketches, the future looks like fun. It's sometimes said that municipal architects wouldn't dream of using their own buildings. But looking through these drawings, I found a familiar bearded figure outside the building.
Hello, sir.
Hello. I'm the architect who designed this building.
Ah!
I designed it a long time ago. I did a drawing of this coming up here like this, all these stairs and things. And one level I had me coming in with my family.
The little boy drawn holding George's hand is now adult and an architect himself. Fulfilling George's hopes, today he brings his own family to swim at Brixton Wreck. George's architecture gives me a twinge of envy for the generation that grew up with its optimism. the lunch club where the retired could enjoy their better pensions and the longer lives given them by the welfare state. Housing, built as a right, not an asset. A space perhaps to tune into that other monument of leisure modernism, the Open University. And a sports centre's emphasis on physical pleasure that mirrors the politics of the time, that for the first time encouraged people to enjoy their bodies in more private ways, with newly civilised laws on abortion, homosexuality and divorce. But this bid to build a society that was both egalitarian and free would soon be overrun. My parents' generation, nurtured from birth by the welfare state, were by the late 60s finding it oppressively restrictive.
There you go. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom. Very good. I wonder if I can start you at the beginning, really. I want to come back to lots of the themes picked up in there, of course, but I suppose I want to start with the question, what motivated you? Well, what made you what inspired you, I suppose, or who inspired you to make the documentary in the first place? What led you to that?
Well, as a filmmaker, you're kind of obliged to make films. And you have a choice between earning a living making films that often aren't that fulfilling and hoping that you can sometimes get to make films you do want to make. And I had this weird confluence in my life at the time between actually making quite a lot of money, making incredibly tedious films. Mostly TK Maxx paid to make that film. I think all these internal training films for them. And thinking I really ought to spend this money on something other than like cheap wine, drugs and meals out. So yeah, I decided to make the film instead. But in terms of the ideological drive to do it would be that I am quite resentful of our current political discourse. I think it's a cheat. I wanted to remind people of a time when politicians actually offered us better options of the future. They weren't always the same, but they were kind of saying, oh, we'll give you a nicer house, we'll give you a better education, we'll make your life last longer. These are quite nice things to offer people. And the kind of, let's defend you from all the ills of the world that we've just summoned up, politics that have dominated definitely my adult life. In fact, to be honest, no, I was born in 1978, so I was about one and a bit when Mrs. Thatcher came to power. So after that, my political life has been dominated by people who wanted to make people's lives worse and a kind of discourse of hate. So I wanted to say it doesn't have to be like that.
It's very good. I mean, you're absolutely right, and obviously we're very similar ages, so I share the kind of same experience of having grown up in that context. And I'm sure that part of my fascination, in particularly brutalist architecture, but the architecture of this era, is absolutely to do with that whole utopian vision. We'll come on to, I think there's sort of something very important about nostalgia, which we're certainly going to talk about, and I think that sort of plays through in lots of different ways. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about your relationship and how that grew with some of the architects as you were making the film. I know that you had very close relationships with George and also with Kate McIntosh. But maybe just talk a little bit about some of the architects that you encountered and how, I suppose in a way, how the relationships differed and how that affected the final cut too.
I think the way I tackle projects is I'd like to believe I was deeply analytical about them, but actually I tend to do lots of research, but then kind of just dive in and see where it goes. And I made this is deeply cynical and horrible, but it's necessary. Who's oldest? Because these people are very elderly, and so I literally went through, worked out the dates of birth, started at the beginning. So I think the first person we contacted was Oliver Cox, who was born in about 1923, I think. And it was the correct choice because he died before production finished. And I went to meet this very frail old man, and we'd exchanged letters, and because he didn't do email, so we had got these incredibly neat, beautifully typed letters with, he said, come around and film. And then when I got there, he was terrified. He was this little man, all hunched and nervous looking. And he said, oh, could we have a cup of tea first? So we sat in his kitchen, which obviously, as with all architects of that generation, they'd rebuilt their house or made it entirely in their sort of vision, and had a cup of tea, and he slowly worked out that I wasn't there to do a hatchet job on what modernism had been, and his contribution to that. And he went from being this very frail old man with hunched shoulders to suddenly his shoulders went back, his head went up, his energy levels went up, and he was chatting away and all enthusiastic. And we shot an interview, and what I always do is I send an unedited version of the footage to the person so they have a record for their own use and just to kind of build trust and show that this is how... I like to involve people in the process. I think it's only fair. I know a lot of people in television don't do that, but I don't approve of that. And anyway, a few days later, after sending the DVD, I got about a 6-page type letter with his comments, which were basically, I think I could have answered the questions better. And I showed this to a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and he thought the lighting could be better. So maybe we could both try harder. And we'll do it much better second time round. So anyway, I liked him. There's something very, very warm and engaging about him. And it was quite, he'd repositioned the relationship a bit like a teacher-pupil thing, which made him happy. And it was, I don't know very much about the subject, it suits me. So I go around and film him again. And then afterwards I said, who was your friend who was the filmmaker? And he goes, oh, I've known Ken Loach since the late 60s. So we did actually use bits of both. And then he said, so the point of bringing him up was that he had, he said, I'd like to introduce you to some of my friends who live in the estate that I built. And I thought, that sounds fantastic. You know, he's now doing the research for us too. So we hire a van and we drive him down to the Alton estate. And I mean, we've not seen that sequence, but there's these people that he's known for years because he had this deeply held belief that as an architect, you should experiment. The nature of experimentation is that some of what you do will succeed, some of it won't succeed, most of it will be somewhere between the two poles, and you research and you document and you publish, and so that other architects can gain from your experience. And so he had built this relationship up with people in the area. He was very fortunate because he grew up in an era where you could do that because you had a long-term contract with central government or a local authority. Nowadays, if you were in private practice and you said, oh, actually, we fucked up that job, it'd be like, you never get hired again. So he was in a... there were quite good benefits the way he could work, but he'd evolved a way of working like that.
And I know you had some... I mean, you're in the business, really, in doing what you've been doing of oral history, and of course that's the sort of idea of narrative, which I want to come on to in just a second, but I know that you had interesting experiences, and I have a particular passion for Pimlico School, which I've done some research into myself, and Tom very kindly shared the footage that he'd taken, the full unedited footage that he'd taken of John Bancroft. But I know that there you had a really fascinating issue of doing all of this footage and then gradually realising that he was actually in the early stages of dementia. And so really having to sort of assess quite carefully what footage you could include in the film, what you couldn't, and I think thinking through that whole business of narrative. So I think there's something very interesting about the architect's creation of narrative. I think this is something that still exists, but I think was probably particularly there when at the back of all of it is some kind of utopian intention. So I wondered if you might just say a little bit about how you kind of dealt with that narrative, and maybe go on to explore why you think there's such an apparent disconnect between that utopian intention and then, of course, what we see later, the kind of dystopian, in some cases, outcomes.
Well, I think that there are, to strip it down, there are a series of generational experiences. I mean, you've got the kind of first generation British modernists, the Lasdons, the Lebeckins, the Goldfingers, and seems to be, obviously I never met any of them, but they were quite hardened people because actually they were breaking down walls of resistance. There was very little money to do what they wanted to do. The sum total of pre-war British modernism is tiny. And they were the ones who actually were the sort of warriors who created an environment for a subsequent generation to do stuff. Then you see the post-war architects, and in a sense they were blessed because they had a set of political ideals and they were actually swimming with the tide. And so they actually got the chance to do huge amounts of work and experiment, build at scale. I mean, someone like George had built so many buildings by the time he was 30, 35, extraordinary. I mean, I travel around London and I can see, oh, that's one of George's towers. They ran them off from the plans, so they'd be saying, oh, that one works, we'll use that in 15 other locations. That's an extraordinary kind of achievement to have, and that must have been a really enjoyable time to live in and be a successful architect. Then you see the attacks on the modern movement start from within because, as I just said about Oliver, there was a kind of sense of evolution, self-examination and improvement. But then you see there's actually a whole series of attacks that come from really the post-Suez New Left, who are saying this is a form of architecture that doesn't reflect the experiences and the variety of society. and we need to be more textured, have a more textured understanding of society. Now, the irony is that the architectural profession were thinking the same thing, probably a few years behind, because by the time your project's designed and built, there's always going to be a time lag. But actually, who got the political wind in their sails from that? It wasn't the left at all, it was Mrs. Thatcher, who said, yes, I believe in the texture of society, I just believe in your texture a bit more if you're rich.
Yeah, no, I mean, but maybe just comment a little bit more on I suppose what you think the real sort of factors were that, I mean, I think there's something very interesting around, of course there's the political element, which you've talked about. Neave Brown says somewhere in your film, it's not that modernism failed, but the architects of the period simply didn't do it well enough. Do you think there's something around materials and money too, in that respect? And do you think there's something also about style and fashion and changing taste? Certainly with Pimlico School, one of the interesting things that I discovered, I suppose, about that was that by the time it was opened, it was already deeply unfashionable. And when you start to read the reviews of Pimlico School, literally from the year that it's opened, it already feels like it's about 10 years behind its time educationally, which of course is the lag.
There are several things there. I mean, first of all, I think Neave's assessment of post-war British architecture is a little unfair. I don't think he'd be offended by me saying that he's the one thing he doesn't lack is a confidence in his own abilities, and he's an extraordinarily brilliant architect, and not everyone is going to be as good as him. But he also said to me actually that you can. The essential key to being a good architect is being a good architect, not what your political beliefs are. He said there are lots of very bad left-wing architects and lots of quite good right-wing architects. So probably the key thing there is to practice and do work, and then you can learn again. Well, that seems to be my theme of the evening. But in terms of Pimlico School, it was built to a brief that had been superseded by the time the school was completed. And you can argue that one of the problems with that era's architecture is everyone believed they were so analytical and they were working out what would work. And actually, when things change, then they're no longer appropriate. Something and it's not in this film, but take the example of the teaching wall at UEA. It's fine if all the faculty stay the same size. As soon as you say, oh, actually, that department's not really very popular, let's shrink that. Or this one's growing, where do they go? And you end up with porta cabins for outspill. So there is a danger with that era that it didn't have a huge amount of flexibility in some of the design. But isn't that the essence of good design? Actually, a good house. Look at the Georgian house. The Georgian house has survived, and we like it because taste reflects politics. Aesthetics. Boyd, you dealt with this much better than I can, but the Georgian house is popular because actually it has evolved. It can be modified in many, many different ways.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something around that flexibility issue, but I'm still interested in the sense in which someone like the Barbican is, I think, by anyone's assessment now, a success in the way that somewhere like the Balfron Tower, which I know is a sort of hot political potato at the moment, and we might come on to talk a little bit about that, but somewhere like the Balfron Tower is still seen by many as a failure and some as a success. And I'm just not sure why that is. Is that down to kind of materials, and is it sort of purely down to kind of a sense of craftsmanship in that building?
I'm unconvinced by that argument, to be honest. I think aesthetics are a social construct like anything else. We say something's beautiful because we've soaked that up from the culture and it reflects our interests generally. So the Barbican is beautiful because actually people who live there have agency. They've chosen to live there. They're wealthy, so that they will celebrate their choices, and they have the confidence they're wealthy that they'll go around talking about how wonderful it is and how wonderful they are by the fact that they can afford to live there, and they do live there. So no one questions it. And that which goes with agency is the fact that you accept the limitations, because you go, well, I chose to be here, so the fact I don't have a 14-acre garden is something I've accepted, not something that's been imposed on me. Now, Balfron, the central problem with social housing in the post-war era is really about housing management. It's about who do you allocate to that housing? Do you allocate the correct resources to maintain it to a good standard? And what level of intervention do you make in order to make sure that everyone can live alongside each other peacefully? And Balfron, because it isn't the Barbican, and it has been traditionally lived in by relatively poor people, has acquired all the stigma that British society is so good at applying to people who are working class. It's more the problems of a class-based society than of the architecture. And you'll see, yes. It's going to be, it's being privatised, it's going to have extra bedrooms put in. So flats are going to, people will have less living space effectively, and then it will become sought after and lovely.
Yes. No, I'm well aware. We will come back to that. I want to, because as some of you will know, the National Trust did a project at the Balfron Tower 2 years ago now, and it is kind of interesting case study. I mean, so we're kind of into the world of aesthetics a little bit, but it seems to me that there is still a question around perceived failure of this architecture somehow relating to, and we also have to be realistic that those architects set out with the intention to create it to look in a certain way. So
the question is, where is that perception taking place?
Yeah.
Because if you look at, if perception is by people who are writing architectural criticism or by people who write opinion pieces in newspapers who don't live anywhere near that housing, and they drive past it and they're being programmed to go, oh my God, the poor. And it's like, oh, they used to be able to ignore the poor. Now you can see them at 22 stories high. How dreadful. Whereas actually, is that the experience of the people who live there? Now, from making the film, you'd be travelling around, you'd be standing there and people would come and talk to you like, what are you doing? And fair enough, reasonable question. And so I'm making a film about social housing, actually it was never meant to be a film about social housing, it was about social architecture. It was just that housing was the largest component of that project. And they'd tell you, you get these statements like, oh, it's a concrete jungle. And then about 2 minutes into the conversation, they say they lived there for 30 years, they wouldn't dream of living anywhere else, that their ex-partner lived there and their children lived there, and it was kind of like this sense of intense community that you can get. And I'm not sure that actually it's like I say, whose perception? You see?
I suppose I'm thinking of, use one example as a case in point, which might be the South Bank Centre, and thinking of the fact that the Royal Festival Hall is kind of much loved. Both buildings, I think, share the same vision. They both share exactly the utopian vision that your documentary is all about. And yet, the Royal Festival Hall is sort of much loved, appreciated. It's somehow easy on the eye, that sort of Scandi modernism, the herbivores, as of course, sort of famously referred to, as opposed to the brutalist, carnivorous thing next door to it, which, I've done a lot of work to try to change perceptions, challenge perceptions of that particular building, but I'm still aware that there are a huge number of people out there who would much rather see it pulled down than, undergoing the current refurbishment that it's...
But I bet if you'd gone back 30 years, you'd have had people saying that about the Festival Hall.
Yeah.
I think there's a time lag.
Yes.
There's a taste time lag. I had this interesting experience of making a film with this lady who wrote about homes and property for the Daily Mail, and I had the same discussion with her. This was about 10 years ago, and she said, oh, everybody loves the Festival Hall, but no, the Queen Elizabeth Hall and the Hayward, they're hideous. And that was it. End of conversation. There was no further engagement. But I bet now she's probably going, oh, there's the texture to the concrete. And,
well, I hope so. That's exactly what I was
She's probably been on one of your tours.
Yeah, I really hope so. The National Trust membership is largely Daily Mail readers.
Do you want people like that to like what you're doing? Because lots of left-wing politicians of the 80s said, you knew you were doing your job right when the Daily Mail hated you.
Actually, the simple truth is we almost always set out to try to raise the ire of the Daily Mail, and it's been a great disappointment to me that we've not managed to do it as much as I had wanted to do. But you're sort of into now, I think, interesting territory around nostalgia and heritage and all of that business. And I know you, I think correctly, in my view, have concerns about the aestheticisation of this particular period and in some ways perhaps about the rise of it being conceived as heritage. That said, in the film and in the clip that we just saw, you talk about the envy that you have for that generation of its optimism. So I wonder how you kind of slightly reconcile those things, because I wonder whether we can really... whether being nostalgic for that age simply involves us being nostalgic also for the whole thing, for the buildings, and also whether that is, in some cases, the only way that we can protect them.
I think that the thing I really wish to protect about the architecture, I do love it on an aesthetic level, but actually is the social function. Somebody at the 20th Century Society, when the Finsbury Health Centre was under threat, suggested it should be turned into a corporate healthcare facility, as in that a drugs company could use it or something, so it didn't have to have its usage changed. And somebody else read an article that said it should be bombed rather than that happen to it, because if it wasn't a provision of public health for the entire community, it was no longer doing what it was there for, and Lebetkin would have wanted it bombed, and I suspect that was right. I don't particularly want to go around bombing things, but I do think we need to use whatever means available to us to resist the growth of neoliberalism and the privatisation of public space and the removal of things that were once collectively owned and the transfer of those things to the private sector, because it's not like we're all getting some compensation each time something's stolen off us, which is effectively what's going on. Yes, I am envious of that era, because it would be lovely to live in an age where you really didn't worry about global warming. You believed that oil was $1 a barrel, and you could believe that everything was getting better in the world and that there was increasing amounts of prosperity and money to do wonderful things like art and leisure, as well as making new technology. I do kind of think, though, that we could regain that, and it's actually about the ambition. We wouldn't be going back to the 1960s, but it is possible for us to conceive of making a better world, but it really is about working out how we share the common resources of humanity.
Do you think that moment, with the rise, particularly thinking of artificial intelligence, might be coming? There seems to be, at the moment, a lot of conversation about what kind of work people are going to do in the future, and how much work there will actually be available. And so whether it's, I'm sort of very struck again by the clip we saw and that moment where, you can say the same, that I know my grandfather and absolutely would have been incredibly shocked at the idea that we all work as hard as we do. I think he would have thought that by this time we'd all be working maybe 3-day weeks at most, and spending most of our time in leisure activity. So, do you have any sense that time might be coming, or that there might be a way that we can almost
I think this is one of the big battles that are ahead of us, and if we don't, we're either going to, for example, I just rode across London with lots of boxes of camera equipment the other day in an Uber, and the guy was telling me how he would earn £1,200 a month when he started, but now there are so many people on there, he's making £1,200 a week, and he's making £450 a week. Well, when you're operating the car, that goes from being a really good job, not a very enjoyable job, but a lucrative job, to a really shit job. And it's all about who owns the machine.
Yeah.
And if we don't fight and resist, because that's what's needed, and we have to resist on all sorts of levels, culturally, intellectually, and also standing in line when the police are pushing at you with their riot shields at times, we are going to end up as slaves to about 15 hugely rich people who own the platforms. And I'm not down for that, really. I don't know.
No, neither am I. Unless I'm one of the, no, I'm not. Then relating to that, I think, probably comes the question particularly about architectural practice, about that moment and what might differ between that moment and now in terms of architectural practice. Why was it so possible at that point, and feels, I hope we'll get sort of interesting questions and comments from people later. Maybe you disagree with this, but my sense is that it feels as though that would be impossible at this point in time.
Well, as a non-architect, I'm telling a room full of architects about architecture. The fundamental difference is that there was a huge amount of money and political consent available then. Architecture requires money and political consent above all else, and that there were those factors available to build that world that those people were building. The other thing on a level of career was George is a fascinating character, because his dad was a milkman who later became a bus conductor, and George got a grant to go and study here, and as soon as he graduated, he got a reasonably well-paid local authority job. He rented accommodation in Hampstead while he was studying, overlooking Hampstead Heath. Now, he would never have been able to have a career, because nowadays you'd have to make tea. I remember there's another architect I interviewed, whose name temporarily escapes me, but anyway, he told me that his first architectural job was designing lift housings on the top of a tower block, and I said, that doesn't sound very interesting. And he said, it was a lot nicer than making tea. Now that's, it's the fragmentation of employment, particularly in creative industries, is disturbing, because actually it means that you have to have, either you're prepared to work 4 or 5 jobs in your spare time, or you have family money to support you. That kind of narrows not just the talent pool of who's available, but more worryingly, it narrows the social experience. And if you're building for a breadth of society, and those people who are contributing in that field only come from a very small strata of that society, they're not going to build very well, because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the cultural knowledge to build appropriately for the society in which they live.
So what does that mean for architectural education? what, I mean, is there something, you know, here we are, we're in this kind of hub of lively, spirited, thoughtful engagement, a place that engages with the future of architecture and society too. Is there any hope for recapturing that spirit of utopianism?
There's always hope.
There's always hope, but you know, can we do it? Is there, or maybe, actually, I'm asking a slightly different question. I'm asking maybe, what would the architects that you interviewed, what would they say to the students of today?
I'm thinking about when they have spoken to students of today. They're normally quite, I say guilt's not quite the right word, they feel sorry for them. They think you haven't got the conditions in which it's easy to become good at your job and to do good work. Now, I don't know enough about it, and I don't want to put words in other people's mouths, but if you look at that first generation of the sort of warrior modernists, they spent an awful lot of time putting on shows and presentations showing how their work could engage with the broader social project, and they formed alliances. Politically, we look at Lebetkin's alliance with the radical left within Finsbury Borough Council so that he got to build his early works. That was absolutely central to the construction of the welfare state in this country because it was a prototype and it showed this thing could work. So I suppose if you want to rebuild that, you form alliances with other people. You function in the world of culture to show that there is an alternative because neoliberalism is based around the idea of no alternative, which is bollocks. And you also find levels on which you can build so that you can actually show this works. I think in terms of progressive politics, one of the big problems is that we constantly bang our heads against these huge edifices, and actually it would be more sensible if we tried to construct little victories, because little victories make you feel like more is possible.
That's a nice point to hand over to all of you, I think, for comments, questions. I don't know if there's a roving mic or if we need one. I can see that we've got a question just over here, near the front.
Hello. You mentioned, following the first question, that most of the motivation for producing this documentary was reminiscent, kind of nostalgia of a more politically utopian period.
I think I say anger, not nostalgia. Okay. Rage, I think was the word.
So you were particularly angry at kind of the utopia that was being sold to these communities, or do you feel reminiscent for it?
I think when I was born, I lived in a society that was not always effectively, but at least claimed to be organised in order to maximise benefit for its citizens. And now we live in a society where it's quite clear that we don't live in a society, we live in a series of fragmented groups. And we have a governing class, political class, economic class, who are interested in serving only their own interests, and those are people that will sustain their power. And I think you can see that very much in the architecture. I mean, in the 1950s, the 60s and 70s, the tallest buildings in the city said, you know, these are homes of ordinary citizens. And you look at the dominant buildings in the city now, they say these are the accommodation for banks and the extremely wealthy. Now, that's not the kind of society I want to live in. And I feel it's that feeling of having something stolen from you.
I completely agree with you. However, kind of tracing back to the first question, it was made very clear through the video and through the following questions that the film itself and the rest of the conversation kind of created this image of a failed utopia once it physically manifested. So my question is that being said, yeah, I think your motivation is quite a bit cynical in the sense that...
I don't think it was a failed utopia. I think that it's unrealistic in life to expect anything to be perfect.
Okay.
And if you try and achieve anything on a grand scale, then it's going to have its variations. And I actually think you could give the British modernist movement, so let's say B+. Because if you look at the society that they emerged from, most people in this country have indoor sanitation, they have heating, they don't have drafts running through their homes, they don't have rats running through their feet, they are better educated, they live longer lives. I think that's a pretty major achievement. Now, the irony is we pick it apart today by going, it's not perfect. Well, considering where they started, they achieved quite a lot.
So, essentially, that's like a sense of over-marketed kind of naive optimism from that utopia. And my question is, how is that better than the kind of political current environment? And if you don't regard that as a failure, I'm curious to know.
I don't necessarily agree with your first assertion, though. I don't think that it wasn't over-marketed. I mean, there was a sense that people did believe in the 1940s that they really could build a world without flaws, but I think they were aware of the textures. I mean, they were aware of the complexity of the challenge. And if you don't think there's anything wrong with the settlement now, then okay, that may be deeply held belief of yours, but maybe you should go and look around the society we live in outside of the experiences you have of it, because it's quite messy the way this country is now.
No, I completely agree. I was just curious as to your position.
Well, I'd rather live in a society where the people who make decisions about my life are clearly elected. I can get rid of them when I don't want them. That the urban environment in which I live is planned by a democratically accountable local authority where I can turn up and actually I can go and shout abuse at the councillor in the street. I can stand to be the councillor. I mean, I was out canvassing for the Labour Party the other day, and I didn't know who was with me, and halfway through this trip I met this guy who was the head of housing for Hackney, and I made a couple of assertions about what I believed Hackney's housing policy were, and I was corrected because and now it's fantastic to have that level of interaction, and that's how you make good policy decisions. Now that's fantastic that what they're doing in social housing. The trouble is most of the built environment in the city is now dominated by developers, and thankfully we don't have Boris Johnson anymore who'll step in and take power away from the local authority, but it's kind of, I'd rather the fact that they will make mistakes, but at least they're accountable to me and my fellow citizens, than they're not accountable to anyone, and they don't care if it's a mistake because they made their money and they've gone off with it.
There is some hope in the form of Sadiq Khan, I suppose, and some of his housing policies. Any other questions? Yep, one at the back.
Sorry, I can't hear it very clearly. I don't know if the mic...
I don't think the mic's on. Yeah, the mic's on. It's on, but it doesn't work. Maybe if you move...
Can you move just slightly forward? Yeah.
Asking about if we see housing as a way to engage with the city, does housing act as a city fabric? And in that sense that...
It's a fairly central part of the city, isn't it? I mean, if you...
Well, that's the sense that everyone lives there, but in the sense that as users of the city, can we really engage with it, and does it add to the life realm? And now how it's become so privatised, and I guess the development issues, does it give back to the city or not? And do we have to go all the way back to this idea of utopia to...
I don't think you should ever go backwards. I don't think go backwards is a possibility. It's just that you can learn from the past and you can work out what's good and what's bad. I think that housing look at London now, actually, it's interesting because everything is dominated by the need to create housing. So we're destroying industry and employment in order to create spaces for housing. I mean, there's a bigger issue that no one seems to be seriously questioning whether London can grow indefinitely. If you look at the central conception of the Abercrombie plan is that London should have a cap on its size, on its growth, and also on its population and its densities. Now, you may or may not agree with where Abercrombie set those parameters, but I think it's quite a sensible thing to do. And it's also a sensible thing to present in a democratic process so that people can have some opinion about it, both through public debate and then also through elections. I actually think London can't continue to grow at this rate. It will become a very strange place to live in. You've already you're having this construction of developer-led properties everywhere, which are normally the finish is nice, but the space standards are appalling. And the trouble with architecture is it's not even about the political context it's built in. Unless it's truly dreadful and you've got loads of money to replace it, you're stuck with it for years. And we're in a situation where we're lumbering ourselves with lots of very, very bad buildings.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
So I think, is it working? No, it's not. Okay, I'll just speak. A key turning point was clearly the oil crisis, and I think you alluded to that briefly. A lot of this architecture is conceived in an age where that enables this kind of social provision, and then suddenly it falls off a cliff. But if you look today, British architects are engaged designing social architecture in oil and gas-rich countries. So it's possible that this utopian vision exists somewhere right now. We don't have the narrative to properly explain where that transition from it being here to there, because people don't like to accept the reality of oil dictating everything. But then also right now, because we have a lot of economic uncertainty linked to fluctuations in oil prices, it could be that the return to utopia here is on the horizon, or will disappear everywhere on the planet.
I think that the return to utopia is obviously unattainable. That's the first thing we should probably have said at the beginning about this. It's just, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't reach for things you can't quite get. I mean, it's an aspiration, and the way we will regain utopianism within our culture and politics is by asking for it as a mass civil action. It's our expectations as a citizenry that have been managed downwards by quite cynical people, and we need to manage them back up again. The reason we have the right to vote in this country universally is because there was an economic crash in 1866, and there were riots, and they passed the Representation of the People Act, which didn't give women the vote, but it gave most men the vote, most male householders, and then there was a series of acts of civil disorder leading into the suffragettes, and that was actually saying, we're not going to put up with this, we have a higher aspiration than the people who are running this country. And they don't like it, but eventually they back down because there's 60 million, roughly, people living here, and there's a few thousand of them. Now, things like oil crises and things like that, yes, those are external factors that will throw these things in different directions, but basically it's about our levels of optimism and our commitment to that optimism.
Another question? Yes, we've got one down at the front here. Oh. Yes, it might work this close to the front, where we'll be able to hear you anyway.
You at the front, Will?
Yeah.
Is this working? No. Okay, just stand up. I've got a couple of points I'd like to make. Firstly, prompted by utopianism, I think we need to be more analytical in the way we locate it. Because the guys that we're talking about after the Second World War, who were building this kind of architecture, they clearly were inspired by utopianism, and they had these fantastic dreams of the kind of society that they were going to build. But that was itself historically formed in the conditions after the Second World War. And it's very easy to fall into the kind of the myth of the welfare state and think that everything was terrific from 45 to 73, and that those nasty people, who you particularly don't like at all, were no longer in control, but they were. Basically, this was not a non-capitalist system. This was a phase of capitalism in which the capitalist crisis after the Second World War was managed by Keynesian economic policies, which included social provision. So all the stuff we're looking at, we have to understand as part of this restructuring of capitalist society that took place after the Second World War. So these guys were not free agents, and I think it's more, rather than just use the term welfare state, I think it's more useful to use the term corporate and social welfare state. Because what governments were doing after 45 was restructuring corporatism, i.e. businesses, and as part of that they were carrying out these big social programs. But the point of it, just to be kind of really instrumental, the point of it was not to make life better per se, but it was by making life better to ensure the continuation of a set of economic
totally agree, yeah.
So I think when we talk about the utopianism of these guys, we need to locate it in that setting. And remember, at least just at a very basic level, the buildings that were being built by big contractors who were making loads of money, and that was the way they were operating. And they had to employ the architects because they were the people who had the design skills. So I think when we talk about the success and failure of this, we have to be very careful about the criteria that we're using. That's observation number one. Observation number two, in George Finch's drawings of the tower, we see kids living. This is family housing that is being proposed at levels of up to 23 stories above the ground. And at no point was it established that tenants actually wanted to live in high-rise towers. In fact, quite the opposite. It was well known right from the mid-50s onwards that people didn't want to live in high-rise, they wanted to live in low-rise, but the architectural concept was of this thing called mixed development, where you had high towers combined with maisonettes. And that was a fundamentally flawed concept, because it was based on the notion that housing managers had nothing better to do than move households within the housing stock. So the notion was that when you were young and, young married couple, you didn't have kids, you'd live in a flat. Then when you had kids, you'd move down and you'd have a nice little house or maisonette. And then when the kids are gone, you'd move back up into a flat. And so it was based on this notion that housing managers were going to kind of be chasing you round through your life and aligning you with the housing type that the architects and the local authority provided, which was complete fiction. So by the early 60s, this was established. This was known that putting families in high towers had really, really damaging effects on family life. And so what you then get is the reform of the welfare state. And I think, therefore, we want to be clear that there are these two different phases. There's the initial phase, which is from the 50s and which what you were showing belongs to, which is based on, in terms of housing, is based on mixed development. Then there's the critique of that, and there's the formulation of an alternative. And you mentioned Neave Brown a couple of times, but clearly Neave Brown was at the forefront, not the only person, but was one of those architects who was responding to those criticisms and saying, right, can we develop a type of housing that doesn't involve sticking families 23 floors up in the sky. So I think if we look at that within the corporate social welfare state, which is what I want to call it, we see architects as one group of actors who come up with a proposal which is built massively all across the country, which engenders its own problems, and there's then a second attempt. And of course, those projects of the second phase only come to fruition as the era of the social and corporate welfare state is coming to an end. Things like Alexandra Road finished in 79-80. A lot of those big second wave projects finished at that time when the tap is being turned off. But let's be clear, the tap is not just turned off by Margaret Thatcher. It's very easy to demonise her. She does it with enthusiasm, but the tap had been turned off in 75 to 76 with the IMF crisis. There wasn't that same production of social housing coming through from the mid-70s onwards. Sorry, that's very long. But
that's okay.
Those conceptual clarifications are really quite
So I want to get Tom's response to that, but I think we also probably have a response to it from the back, or at least another question. So if we can start to work the microphone towards the back as well, while Tom...
I think the microphone doesn't work, so I just have 2 comments.
Go on.
Okay.
Go for it.
I have a very short attention span, so I may forget the first question, but I'll try. Okay.
Well, actually, I'm sorry. I don't have a question. I just had a comment to the gentleman in the blue shirt listening to you talk. 2 things. One, you said people were at some point asked before these high-rises were built about whether they wanted to live in towers, and they said no. And my comment to that would be, why would they say yes? If it was just a concept, if they hadn't experienced it, of course, people who are have spent their whole life experiencing one type of architecture wouldn't be lining up to experience something different. Also, as a person who has lived during her life in a high-rise building, I wanted to ask you, mentioned that there were damaging effects on the families living in these high-rises, and what were those? Because I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so we're going to let Tom respond to that. I know there's someone else who wants to.
First of all, I totally agree that the welfare state that people like myself on the left in Britain now celebrate was basically an invention of Bismarck, who was far from a socialist. It was an alternative revolution. But then also revolutions can be quite messy and go more wrong. So actually a kind of progressive, incremental corporate state it delivered more than, it's probably better than living in Stalinist Russia, and it's definitely delivered more than the neoliberal iteration of capitalism. And the discussion about living in towers versus living in low-rise buildings. Yes, it was definitely identified by the 1950s. One of the interesting things was that the LCC did have a limited range of sociologists working for it who went and analysed people's living patterns and attitudes from the estates they built. Nothing like on the level of analysis that maybe has gone on subsequently. But I think some of that goes back to wartime planning. The conception, when you were in the army in the Second World War, as most of these people had been in the armed forces, you were told where to go and live and you were told what to do. And they carried over a lot of those attitudes in terms of we would just move people around like components within a system. And obviously that doesn't really map with how people live. Just because we've seen George designed a low-rise, high-density scheme, which is still standing somewhere just off the old Kent Road, which he was trying to replicate the kind of musey, what would have been called slum housing of those days, but using plan types, because all the architects had to build with approved plan types that were designed for using in high-rise buildings. But instead of having a central corridor, that was a street, and it had bits reaching over the top, and it was really quite beautiful. It's incredibly run down now, but he built this and was told by the LCC planning committee, because this was about 58, 59, that it looked too much like the slums. And they wanted the vision of modernity, which was this mixed development of high-rise and maisonettes. But the other thing to remember is that the most common housing type in the post-war era of Britain was the four-storey maisonette, because it didn't need lifts and things like that. So we talk about high-rises a lot, but actually the dominant form was 4 floors high.
I think, Tom, having tied it back to George Finch, I think we should tie things up there.
Okay.
James, am I right in saying that there are drinks? There are, very good. So I think we should continue conversation, debate over drinks. All that really remains for me to do is to thank the Architectural Association for having us here, and also to thank Tom Cordell. Please join me in thanking him.
What happens if I pull that out?
No, I was going to say a lot about